Posted by you/Vanix1450. What was the creepiest or most paranormal thing that's ever happened to you? One afternoon in college I came back from classes and decided to sit on the couch and have a snack. After that, I just passed out. I had a nightmare of some bloody-faced demonish thing screaming in my ear at the top of its lungs. Woke up and went about the rest of my day. My roommate comes back later that night and goes into his room as I'm sitting in the main living area. At some point, he lets out this random startled scream which leads to me running down the hall to see what's going on. He looks at me and goes, "I swear to God someone with a bloody face just walked from your bedroom into the bathroom." I never told him about the nightmare I had earlier in the day. I didn't sleep for 2 days. Nothing ever happened again. My brother and I were home alone one night watching TV. My mother was working a night shift and my father was out. Father came home and pushed the door ajar and poked his head through to say hello. We both turn around and say hello back, and father closed the door. 30 seconds after, another man opens the door to say hello. We both turn around and say hello back, and the man closes the door. We assume a friend of my father has come back to the house too. Anyway, about 5 minutes later I head into the kitchen where my father was, making dinner or whatever, and I'm expecting to see his friend again. I see that he's alone making dinner and assumed his friend was upstairs in the bathroom. I ask my father who his friend is. My father looks at me and asks me, "What friend?" I reply, "The guy who came back with you." Dad looks at me thinking I'm some sort of weirdo. He says I came back home on my own. Biggest what I've ever experienced. My brother was freaked out to the max. Remembering the man's face, he was pale looking and had bright white hair. When I was in college I house sat for my parents. I'm a bit of a scaredy cat, so I locked every door leading up to the bedroom when I went to bed at night. I had the weirdest dream that someone unlocked each door and turned on every light. I felt cold and woke up to my dog barking. All of the lights in the house were on and every door open and unlocked. My dog wouldn't stop barking at anything in the hallway. I sat in the shower with my dog and a phone the rest of the night, scared to death. My grandmother's house had a very distinct smell. Nothing bad though, just a grandmother's house smell. Anyway, when she came to visit us she always used to sit in a specific chair in the living room. Shortly after she passed away, my father, my older sister and myself came home, and when we walked into the living room and we all smelled her. My dad said, "Hello Ethel," and the smell disappeared. I would be skeptical if just one of us experienced this, but it was all three of us. My grandfather passed away when I was 8 and my little brother was 2 or 3-ish. He had this big lazy boy chair in the living room that he always planted himself in. Everyone knew this chair was Grandpa's chair. Anyway, we went down to my grandparents' house in Florida for a long weekend to attend the funeral, etc. We were all chatting the first night there in the living room, and my mom was sitting in the lazy boy chair. My little brother goes up to my mom and says Grandpa wants his chair back. My mom asks him where Grandpa is, thinking he probably didn't understand death, to which he responds, "He's right behind you." My mom bolted off that sofa immediately. Somewhat ironically, something happened to me last night. I got home from work very early in the morning, 2:30 a.m. My house has an entryway or mudroom before you get into the house. I open the front door, step inside, close the front door and proceed to try and find the key to get through the next door to get into my house. So the only light in this entryway is through the glass on the front door. The rest of the room is completely black and I can barely see my hands in front of my face. All of a sudden I start to hear this buzzing/vibrating noise behind me off to the right. House is old, so maybe just weird house noises. Still looking for the key when I notice that the noise is getting louder. Closer, and it has risen in pitch to something like a woman was humming loudly. Maybe it's just ringing in my ear. Out of the corner of my eye, I see a shadow that I thought was from light reflecting outside, move towards me, creeping along the wall. That's when I noticed the vibrating noise was also getting closer to me, and it seemed to be coming in the same direction as the now moving shadow. I'm shitting my pants trying to open this damn door, and when I finally do the noise stops, the shadow disappears, and I'm hoping it was all in my head. I was sleeping in my basement, pretty much my bedroom, and I woke up at some random time in the night for no reason. Rolled over and saw a black figure, probably around 5'10" and with a typical male physique, standing at the side of my bed. It was standing between the bed and the stairs, so there was no way to nope out. I just rolled over and straight up started praying. I rolled back over and it was gone. The next morning I was in the shower, and the curtain was pushed to the side, not all the way, but it noticeably moved. Then when I got out of the shower, my cello's D string was plucked 3 times and then wrung out, which was laying against my chair in the basement. Then I went upstairs and my brother had a hand print that reached across his neck and cheek. It was too big to be his hand, but he was perfectly fine and he slept through the night uninterrupted. 20 or so years ago while living in NM. Driving east on Highway 60 at night between Vaughan and Fort Sumner. Two of us were in the car and noticed a bright light on the right rear side. I mean bright. We then remembered that the train tracks were there. So we kept driving without really thinking about it. Well, the light stayed with us, which was weird because trains usually don't go that fast out there. So, then my friend rolls down the window and looks back to see what it is, and suddenly the light vanishes. Also no sound. So now we're a little freaked. We pull over to check things out. Well, a new realization sets in. There are no train tracks next to the road on this section of road, 34.4866698, minus 104.776733. So, now we're freaked out and bolt out of there ASAP. We told our story to people at work and of course, caught some grief, but that's what happened to us. As a child, I moved around a lot, army brat, and I insisted that every house I moved to was haunted. Nothing major ever happened, just weird noises, opening doors, things being in places that make no sense. It wasn't until my second year at uni that I clocked on that I was haunted, not the houses, after my housemate suggested it. Anyway, last year I was on the way to my uni house from my job at a bar at about 3 a.m. To get into the house you have to walk down a privately owned alleyway. Just as I reach the entrance to this alley, a man runs up behind me and spins me around. He's had a bit too much to drink and starts trying to grab me, touch me up and convince me to remove my t-shirt. Naturally, I'm very uncomfortable and scared. I remember that the window to the house had an alarm that went off if the window was hit. I figured if I could get down the alley and hit the window, my two male housemates would wake up and help. The only issue, every time I walked down the alley he'd grab me again. After maybe 5 minutes of a struggle, the man hit me. Next thing you know, the alarm on the window goes off, waking up my housemates and scaring off the man. The next day the police were called. We gave them access to the CCTV footage at either end of the alley. The man was caught on tape, but, since most of the incident occurred in the alley, there was not enough evidence to charge. Later that day, my housemates and I decided to check the footage to see what caused the alarm to go off. There was nothing. No bird, cat, or any other animal. The alarm just went off. This had never happened before and didn't happen any time after either. I'm convinced it was my ghost. It used to freak me out, but I'm kinda glad it's around now. Not sure if paranormal or not, but I have a weird warning system that functions without any obvious triggers. For example, once I hiked through the forest to some old castle on a hill. To get there, I needed to cross a bridge that goes over a 20-meter deep canyon. I've been there 1,000 times, as I used to live in the area. This particular time I started to get a weird feeling as soon as I stepped into the forest. It got stronger and stronger until it was pure fear. I thought I must have eaten something wrong or so, because there was no reason whatsoever to be afraid. So I tried to ignore it and went on. Right before I stepped onto the bridge, that weird feeling acted up so wildly I almost turned back. Again, I convinced myself that I was stupid and made it to the middle of the bridge. One has quite a nice view from that position into the forest and the rock formations below, so as always I stopped and looked down to the right side of the bridge. Then I turned to the left, but before I could look down, that feeling didn't let me. At that point, I really thought that I must go crazy, but still I obeyed, didn't look down, and made my way to the castle ruin complex that started right behind the bridge. Been there for 15 minutes, when some police officers arrived, started to scream at me to come down, as I was climbing the old walls, interrogated me about who I was, what I did there, and who I saw on my way to the castle, how long I've been there, and how come I didn't see the dead guy under the bridge, on the left side. So apparently he jumped shortly before I arrived. And I guess they thought I was involved or a suicide buddy of theirs and was about to jump from the ruin walls. Turns out I can sense dead people. Or whatever. I had a couple of experiences with that warning system. Weird. March 2015. My father passed a month or so earlier. I wasn't sleeping well. I would be up later and later at night. My father used to always give me shit for staying up so late because it's ruining my sleep schedule and affecting my work, and standard parenting stuff. It's about 2:30 a.m. and I'm watching YouTube on my PS4. Power in the house flickers. I check the window, no rain or wind or anything. I figured somebody hit a pole somewhere. A couple of minutes later, the power goes out for a second but comes right back on. Nothing was affected. This is weird because when the power goes out, electronics reset. Check the window again, still, nothing is happening outside. A couple of minutes later, the power goes out for almost a whole minute. From the couch, I can see the street light outside is still lit, as well as the other houses on the street. Power comes back on and everything is still as it was. Video continues where it left off, clocks haven't reset, nothing. It's now 2:37 a.m. I audibly said okay and went to bed. The next morning I wake up for work. The clock on the oven says 11 something is. My phone says 7:23. It was around 11 when my father left the house the day he passed. Fast forward to January of this year, the 3rd anniversary of my father's passing. I can't sleep. I'm upstairs of my new home, watching Netflix. The power flickers and goes out. I immediately said okay, I'm going to bed. The power comes back on. The next morning, getting ready for work, the oven clock says 11:41 a.m. Dad doesn't like when I stay up too late. I work at several attractions for the Big Mouse that has tourist destinations in Orlando and Anaheim. When I first started working for the Mouse, I learned that most of the buildings were haunted in one form or another. Generally, I take this stuff with a grain of salt. Show me the science or prove it to me, then I'll believe. I've had 2 separate encounters with 2 ghosts in 2 different attractions, and let me tell you, I believe a hell of a lot more now. Experience 1, in a slow-moving journey through time, you come across a scene where a famous painter is lying on his back, painting the ceiling of a building. There is a ladder going up to that scene, and the rumor was that a maintenance guy had a heart attack during his shift one night and dropped at the base of the ladder. No one found him until the next morning, and he was already dead. It became a tradition upon closing the ride for the night to tell him good night, or else havoc would come down upon the ride the next day. Silly, I know, but we all played along. I never really believed in it, everything seemed very circumstantial. On one particularly slow day, I was riding through the attraction when all of a sudden it stopped in that scene I mentioned earlier. Now, if you've ridden this ride, you'll know that it's a train car with 2 rows. Well, as far as I could see ahead of me, there was no one. As far as I could see behind me, there was no one. The ride system is pretty sophisticated. When someone hops out, there are pressure-sensitive mats on one side that trigger the ride to stop and show on our ride display screen exactly where it is. On the other side of the ride vehicle, there are photoelectric beams that also give the exact location of this intrusion, as we call them. Now we stop this ride pretty often. Someone takes too long to get into the ride vehicle, stop it and then start it back up again. Well, in this case, they started speaking over the intercom throughout the entire ride. That usually means someone is out of a vehicle somewhere on the ride. A few minutes into sitting there, I start to hear keys jingling, 2 sets headed in my direction. I'm completely alone, and here come my fellow Mouse employees, looking rather concerned. Iridescent song, did you jump out? Of course, I hadn't, to which I told them. They look at each other, and back at me, both looking from the opposite directions they've come from. Did you see anyone? I hadn't. It was just me. The mat and the I-beam were both triggered in this scene. We all sort of stare at each other and sort of whisper the ghost's name at each other. They leave, and within 5 minutes, we are moving again, but I never rode alone again. In the house I grew up in, it always felt like you were being watched. I'd see shadows out of the corner of my eye and dark mists that would dissolve when you looked straight at them. My older sister was always scared of the attic, especially. She would barricade the door when we were left home alone. I went to the attic quite often to get various things. It's where we kept large toy containers, old clothes, and stuffed animals, and I just liked seeing what I could find. It always felt like I was being watched, though. One time I went up there, and as I reached the top of the stairs, I saw a large, translucent alien-shaped white head looking at me from behind a box. I froze, terrified, and locked eyes with it for a few seconds before it slowly lowered itself down to hide. I turned right back around and left, telling myself I had imagined it, but was scared to go into the attic for years after that. I didn't tell anyone for years. My parents eventually sold the house and we moved, and I've never felt the same way anywhere else I've lived. At a nursing home, working 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. First, I took care of 16 ladies as a CNA on night duty, on my own. The halls have 16 rooms, with a sister hall, same layout, next door, only separated by a sliding door. There's a nurse that oversees the 2 adjoining halls but never saw her much, so it got lonely. As it was a nursing home, the ladies who live there are older and can get sick fast. One lady was sent to the hospital for pneumonia and was gone for 4 days. One night, around 3 a.m., another lady, same hall neighbor to the lady at the hospital, started screaming, "Get him out of my room." Thinking a male resident had wandered from the other side of the building, I ran over to her room. But I didn't see anything. Now, this is a lady who is very with it and never has behaviors or hollers out. But she is hysterical. I figure she had a bad dream and try to calm her down. It took about 15 minutes. When I leave her room, the nurse is on the phone. The lady at the hospital had died 15 minutes ago. Some ghosts walk in the halls, and dark forms I see in certain corners of certain halls. So I guess I was never really alone. The very F at the hotel that I worked at, I started at the front desk and worked the 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. shift. There was someone there with me from 2 p.m. to 10 p.m., so I always had a little more than an hour where I was alone at the desk. Our kitchen closed at 10 p.m., so usually by 10:15 p.m., it was only the bartender and me still there. One night, it was almost 11 p.m. and there was a huge noise that came from the kitchen area. The bartender and I ran back there and saw that every single pot, pan, ladle, and spoon, everything else that was hanging from the ceiling racks, was on the ground. After our shift, we watched the camera back and there was no one in the kitchen when it happened. I have no explanation for it other than it was one of the scariest things that have ever happened to me and I could not get out of there fast enough. I lived in an old house, converted into a duplex, in Athens, Ohio, which is reported to be one of the most haunted American cities. During the first year I lived in my apartment, I frequently noticed this strange music that seemed to be coming from inside the house. It's hard to describe, but it sounded like a keyboard or an organ. It sounded faint and was played in the minor key. Always sounded the same. Regardless, I just chalked it up to my downstairs neighbors, and it never bothered me enough to investigate. It was coming from inside our building. The following year, my original neighbors moved out, and my new neighbor, Sarah, moved in. We became friends. One night, she was hanging out in my apartment and the music started up. She asked me pointedly where the music was coming from, and I said I didn't know she didn't have music playing in her apartment. She said no and we both looked at each other uneasily. Sarah asked me if I ever saw or heard weird things, and I said that other than the music, I hadn't. The way she asked implied that she had, but she didn't want to talk about it. A few months later, her BF moved in, and she later confided in me that she saw and heard things, specifically random tendrils of what looked like smoke swirling inside their bedroom. Doors slamming or opening without explanation. Her BF hated going to the basement so much that he'd sing the whole time he was down there to do laundry. I hated the basement too because it hadn't been changed much since the house had been built and there was a creepy room that looked like where you'd keep a sex slave. I guess it was where it would have been stored. I always felt like I was being watched when I was down there. I graduated and was getting ready to move. I went out of town for a few days so my parents were watching my cat at their place a few hours away. The night I got back to Athens, I decided to start packing some of my books, the first items I'd packed. I fell asleep and woke up in the middle of the night to a giant crash. I was tired and disoriented, so I assumed the noise came from Sarah's place. The next morning, I went to my living room to find that a giant antique mirror hanging over my fireplace had crashed and shattered into hundreds of pieces. The nails supporting the mirror were intact, still in the wall. After that, I was finally prepared to admit that the place was haunted. I know Sarah saw and heard way more than she ever admitted, but she didn't like talking about it because she still lived there. She moved recently, so maybe I'll get more out of her now. I never really believed in ghosts, but too many unexplainable things happened. I never felt unsafe or like whatever was in the house wanted to hurt me or express anger, except maybe at my moving. This story isn't even that interesting, but that's how I've found a lot of people's ghost stories to be. Not everyone has some vindictive poltergeist or whatever. I did do some cursory research into who owned the house. I learned a woman was the original owner. Back then, the house was for a single family. She sounded like a quiet woman, a widow who died at an old age. In her obituary, I learned she loved to play music and had founded the Athens Music Appreciation Group. I wonder if I kept hearing her favorite song to play. I am from the Indian town of Bhubaneswar. I have never quite believed in the supernatural or anything outside the purview of science. This creepy incident happened the time my grandmother died. Being a traditional family, we performed numerous rituals for her so-called heavenly abode to be pleasant. Most of these rituals don't make sense to me, nor do they do now, but I decided against questioning as the timing was gloomy and everyone was mourning. One of these rituals was the preservation of lights inside a closed container. As part of the ritual, her kids, which included my father, are supposed to make a journey taking her corpse from Bhubaneswar to the holy city of Puri, around 50 km, where the Jagannath temple resides, and her sons are supposed to burn her there. Perform the puja and set the ashes on its path to the Bay of Bengal. Meanwhile, there will be a container placed in our home in her room where she used to live, which will be filled with sand up to a certain level, and a lighted earthen lamp is supposed to be put, and the whole container will be covered completely, and the room is locked from outside for no one to enter the room till the sons arrive back to home and then unlock the room. There are supposed to be shapes formed on the sand which will tell the path that she will take to heaven. I was also told that when my grandfather died, the shape formed was that of a ladder, which was interpreted as him going to heaven on a ladder or steps. I of course thought all this was pure idiocy and didn't believe it. Cut to when my father and his brothers returned from the holy city of Puri and the room was unlocked and the container was opened after that, and what I saw surprised and creeped me out. I could see wool shapes being formed on all the sides of the earthen lamp called deep in my language. The wool shapes were barely visible. I even took a photo. They were visible. Grandmother lighting set up a pic. It still creeps me out how that is possible.